Richard Katrovas is the founding director of the Prague Summer Program for Writers and the author of 17 books of prose and verse. He taught for 20 years at the University of New Orleans and is currently a professor of English at Western Michigan University. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Thank you.
I'd like to start by discussing the pros and cons of creative writing programs as they relate to getting published. Because the podcast is an examination of the book and best practitioners associated in all sorts of different roles. So they beat the personality out of you, other people opining about what's good and bad, what they like and what they don't like. And yet what I hear most often from editors is that you need to cultivate your own personality. So how do you work those two together?
Well, first of all, you proceed from two false assumptions. From my point of view, as someone who's been teaching creative writing workshops at every level for the past 40 years, I would say that they do not beat the personality out of you. That's absurd and silly. As far as what editors may say, it depends on what kind of venue the person is directing. Is that individual an editor of a New York house or a commercial house, or the editor of a university press, say, or a Tiffany literary publisher? It depends. It is no doubt the case that the individuals who make the most money for publishing houses, with significant exceptions, are not individuals who have gone through the regime of a creative writing program necessarily. Though anymore these days you'd be very hard pressed to find anyone who has published anything who has not had at least some tangential, some kind of relation to what we call creative writing.
You would think then it's a good thing based on your life.
It's not a matter of it's a good thing or a bad thing. The stars in the sky are neither good nor bad. They are, okay. And I think historically, creative writing, my view of the origins of creative writing is that it has its roots in what we think of as counterculture and the kind of radical egalitarianism that one associates with that period of time, those historical movements, beginning with civil rights movement and of course what we think of the anti-war movement, and the incursion of counterculture values and accompanying sentiments into academe, into that profoundly patriarchal structure as it stood up through the 50s and into the 60s. And creative writing, of course, goes back, I think we can trace it back to any writing pedagogy, which would include, the teaching of rhetoric, before even English departments existed. I think that basically creative writing is based upon the assumption that any girl or boy can. That making art is not an elitist endeavor. That it is something that at least in certain respects can be learned, and that a much greater greater percentage of the population than has been the case in the past is capable of participating in this process that we call literary art making, or we think of as literary art making. I think one has to begin to understand creative writing in the context of humanities education in general, and the ways in which humanities education, creative writing in particular, has radiated through the larger culture. Relative to issues of cultural literacy, relative to issues of class, questions such as what has the effect of the institution of creative writing, the cottage industry of creative writing, had on literature as such. That's the larger question, and is not one that can be answered in 2 or 3 pithy statements.
Overall, has its presence created, quote, better literature? Can you answer that question?
I think it's an absurd question. Okay. But it's one that people will ask.
Right.
It's impossible to answer. I cannot go back in a time machine and change history such that whatever creative writing is, it hasn't emerged and become an integral part of what we think of as English language education, right, which is a part of the larger humanities education. That it has been a determining factor, and a large determining factor, I think is indisputable.
Well, I guess what I'm trying to get at is, we all have our own style because of the lives that we've lived and the
No, we
thoughts
don't.
that we have.
I don't. No, we don't. I don't. No,
Well, let me just finish.
Okay. Yeah.
So, I think of myself as having a style that I've tried to develop over the years.
By style, do you mean a living style or a lifestyle? Or
No,
a writing style?
I mean a writing style.
Okay.
One that I have cultivated. Anyway, so there's that. And I don't know if you can teach that or not. I'm the one that's developed that, and I don't want anyone fucking with it.
First of all, the trope of someone, quote, fucking with it is problematic to me for a multitude of reasons, but be that as it may.
Yeah, no, it's a vulgar way of putting it.
No, it's not a matter of vulgarity. It's a matter of conception. But I go back to your premise that you have an individual style.
Sure.
And I would argue that no one has an individual style up to a certain point.
Right.
That whatever you think of as your individual style are a set of factors that you have taken on through imitation. They are therefore historically based.
Come from somewhere, is that it?
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
There is no style without influence. One can go back to Eliot's tradition in the individual talent, the anxiety of influence.
Yeah.
Harold Bloom. I do extend that really to anyone who's trying to make literary art or any kind of art. There is an anxiety of influence.
Sure.
Now, whether or not it plays out in those broadly Freudian terms that Bloom conceived them is another matter.
Okay.
I think that largely they do.
Right.
So it's so the very notion of originality has to be I think has to be understood as problematic.
Okay. If I can go with that though, that's
Sure.
That's because I believe I've got a style, and it's as a result of being influenced by all sorts of different factors. But I do believe I've got a style. It seems to me that a writing workshop can help me with structure. I don't want it to change my style necessarily. I want to tell a story better.
No workshop is going to change your style.
Okay.
If indeed you see style as a function of personality, then how do we define personality? Blah blah
Right.
blah. You
Right.
get psychoanalysis. So yes, the idea of a personal style is a convenient trope, is what I would say.
Okay.
And it's one that I accept because I think of myself as having a style. But just like personality, style is on a spectrum. And it's one that we can locate. I can recognize this particular writing style as being that of someone who is trying to project a sense of masculinity, of world weariness. One can also maybe see the certain obvious influences. When we think of great writers, we think of Ernest Hemingway. Ernest Hemingway's, quote, style resonates through so much of the literature that followed him that it's become something of a joke. But we speak also of period styles. Period styles transcend individual personalities, and there are period styles. But I think that it's also necessary from time to time for a writer, especially, certainly a critic, to back up and see the larger picture. And to think less in terms of individual style, more in terms of period style. And where one as an individual falls on that continuum. And where one finds one's voice. That, by the way, is the trope, the central trope of creative writing. The finding of one's voice, the discovery of one's voice. This is not something that a creative writing workshop causes, but it can facilitate. And this is true of any arts pedagogy. And I think, again, one has to think of creative writing in the larger context of arts pedagogy. Yes. And then finally, art in general, the function of art in a particular complex social construct.
I like that because I think I've found my voice, but you can help me fine tune it, or what?
I think if anything, we writers, communing, can assist one another as first readers, and not only first readers, but the most sophisticated readers. And not only the first most sophisticated readers, but also the most emotionally invested readers, inasmuch as audience you are facing the person who is showing an early form of a piece of work to you and soliciting your response to it. So the fact of the matter is, a workshop can be, even for the most successful, wildly successful authors, however one conceives of success, as the most salient, responsive, and thoughtful audience one will ever have. Now the point is, once you are in workshop culture, what I would argue is there's a point at which too often people become, I'll use the trope, addicted to that that social entity, which is the creative writing workshop, and that's wrong. That's bad. That's usually, when that, and it's not bad, but when it happens, one has gone beyond art and is in the realm of therapy. Yeah. And the relation of workshop activity to therapy is one of the more interesting ones I think that one can address and consider.
Well, that actually leads me to the question, why do people take these workshops? I've got a couple of thoughts here. I wanted to be just university credits. Therapy, as you say, to meet like-minded people, so there's that social element, to connect, to communicate. What do you think?
Well, I think that, again, one has to go back to that traditional construct of creative writing, which is fiction and poetry. And one has to accept an obvious fact, and that is that poets do not have the same relation to audience that fiction writers have. A fiction writer may at least dream of a larger audience, may at least dream of being remunerated. Whereas outside the context of the the cottage industry of creative writing, poets have no opportunity to monetize what they are doing. And that's just a fact. And yet they are brought together in these social constructs within universities called creative writing programs. Mm-hmm. And within these programs you have usually this dichotomy. Now it's become triadic, in recent years, where they've brought in creative nonfiction as, right. And so now you have this triadic construction. And in our program at WMU, for example, we've included playwriting, and of course other programs have screenwriting. These have been brought in. And basically what that represents is simply an industry growing, for better and for worse. But the initial construct was poetry and fiction. Again, fiction writers may at least dream of being remunerated for their work.
Is that the goal of most of the writers?
No,
to get published and to make a little bit of money? No,
but some do, and whether that is your conscious goal or not, the fact that it is a possibility, the fact that the market construct is such that it is possible for some, means that your relation to that process, your relation to the art part is different than it is for poets, for whom it is really a communal activity, even though within the context of the cottage industry of creative writing, you have now there are ways in which poets monetize what they do by virtue of their place within that complex social structure of American poetry.
So is it mostly ego that drives people to want to get published? Or is it that they have a message for the world?
Hemingway said, if you have a message, send it Western Union. And W.H. Auden said that he, as the judge for the Yale Series of Younger Poets, said that he trusted a young poet who delighted in the music of language more than he trusted a young poet who thought that she or he had anything to say. Of course it begins as ego, but it's also grounded in physiology. I think that is that bright young people at a certain point, when they realize that there may be artifice to verbal expression, and they discover that poetry is the primary means by which that is understood and achieved, then they may start writing poems or songs, which is a form of poetry. They start writing, they expressing themselves, and they fold them up and put them, under their underwear in their drawers, and hide them away and maybe show them to friends. Of course, now with creative writing, a fourth or fifth grader who's written a little prayer can, the teacher will see it and say, "Oh, you're a poet," and well, now we'll form this little group of folks who want to be poets, and the whole idea of poetry workshops, of creative writing workshops, are so embedded in the culture, and particularly in language education, that the role of poet, for example, is much more accessible than it was, say, for our generation and before that. And therefore it's less romantic, for better and for worse.
What about making a record of the fact that you are here, that you you're not forgotten, that you live into
that's
eternity.
That's the ego thing. But I think endemic to youth is a sense of immortality, and so that's not going to be one's initial reason. It's going to be more, from the loins. It's sexual. I mean, sexual. Yeah. Psychosexual. I mean, not exclusively, but in large part. It's the psychosexual dynamic is the engine of lyric discourse. This is no country for old men. Yeats said, and indeed it wasn't. And yet. He was writing some of his greatest poetry as a relatively old man. It was a more cerebral kind of discourse, and it was one that was looking back and was embracing his youth, even as it was looking beyond his temporal existence.
I pulled together some ideas on what you might get out of a writing workshop from, among others, Emma Darwin. That's one website that I referenced. But I just want to bounce these off you to get your feedback.
Okay.
So, on a good course, you'll learn to read as a writer, without which you'll never become a writer worth reading. To find material in the world and use it well.
Yeah, that seems to be a truism.
To find material in your imagination and yourself and develop it. To sharpen and acquire technical tools.
That's certainly true.
Integrate technique and intuition.
That is a primary goal within the process of becoming a writer, a maker of literary art.
To make your own judgments about what to accept, what to adapt, and what to ignore.
I mean, again, truism. That's a pretty complex process, and it really boils down to one's, what we call vision, and that how we define that is very important, because it's the reason for being of whatever we're doing. Yeah. Beyond ego.
Well, I guess to what we initially talked about too, I think is, so how much of this feedback am I going to accept, or am I comfortable living with?
Well, look, the fact of the matter is, even dumb readers of your work can teach you stuff about your work.
Like what, for example?
Even as you're being judged, you are judging those who are judging you, and and you're seeing.
Who the fuck are you to tell me?
Well, yeah, but it's and over time, a group of people, becomes somewhat singular. Takes on a communal personality, and you begin to and you can begin to gauge, what one will say, or the relevancy of what someone has said within the dynamic of the group discourse. That can only be of some value, and it's really up to the writer who is being critiqued to listen artfully. And that's really a part what it's about. It's about an artful listening, and also to understand that every bit as important as listening to what people are saying about your work is listening to what they are also saying about other people's work. Trying to understand what the value of your own voice within that dynamic, and your critic's voice, because one is. every writer is a critic, and every critic is a writer to some extent. And when you're in a workshop, you are most of the time playing the role of critic, of reader critic. So again, it's a complex social dynamic. The workshop is, and my belief is that if one listens artfully, if one participates artfully, one can only benefit from the process. And there have been very few writers who have not had workshop type situations.
Yeah, but you say with their first readers and their friends.
Yeah. The Bloomsbury group, in some way, was a kind of workshop, and the high modernists, those who were living abroad, the expatriate writers of the 20s and the later 40s. They constituted, even if they didn't get together all the time in Parisian bars, they were still carrying on epistolary relationships, and that's hugely important. So I mean, there has always been that. Writers have always sought a sense of community. What has happened with creative writing is that it has formalized that and put it in higher education. The larger issue is the social issue is the evolution of higher education in the humanities, in America, and how creative writing manifested from that. Especially in the historical context of what we think of as counterculture. Yeah, so make of that what you will. Yeah.
Well, actually, it brings up this idea that I don't think that I've really done justice to a book until I've gotten my little group of friends together to discuss it and formed thoughts based on bouncing ideas from what I've read. To me, it's like a completion of the reading process is the conversation.
Well, sure. Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I mean, it's kind of an organic workshop or a sense of literary community. The idea of literary community is important. How that is achieved in different epochs. Yeah. Writing is a lonely endeavor. However, at different times in history, there have been senses of community. Elizabethan England represented, at different times in that time span, there were, Shakespeare had around him a sense of community. They happen to be other actors. We have no idea to the extent to which the actors in Shakespeare's company contributed to the making of these plays or any kind of dramatic writing. Certainly, even Hollywood movies. I mean, they are communal activities. Every TV show, on television, every TV movie, every freaking movie has multiple writers, and that represents a kind of workshop, a kind of committee, a kind of, you're making a singular thing by committee, whereas in a workshop, there are different things that are being regarded by the committee, and there's a sense of editorial contribution, through discourse.
And I think it does improve the sort of end product, if you want to call it that.
It can, and it can also homogenize it.
But there are new ideas that you would never have even conceived of that are brought up for you.
Especially if the workshop, these communities, these small communities, classroom communities, if they're randomly constructed, then yes, you're going to get a much broader representation of a population. Now over here, there's a young woman from Iran. Right. This time we have a young woman from. I think she's going to make it over. I think she just told me that she got her visa. So from Iran, we've had many. We've had over the years writers from Anglophone Asia, and many writers from other languages that simply want to make literary art in the lingua franca. And I feel wholly incompetent to mentor them, and yet they want to do this, so I do what I can. I try as best I can. I try to look past the ESL issues often, and also encourage them to bring as much of their cultural context to the process as they can, and to understand that that's the genius of the English language, the spirit of the English language, is that as reflected in a famous incident, probably apocryphal, in which William Carlos Williams is alleged to have said, after he'd given a reading at a university, college or university, some tweedy academic had come up to him and said, "Where do your poems come from?" And Dr. Williams, the pediatrician, looked at him and said, "From the mouths of Polish mothers." And it's true. I mean, the genius of that statement, whether it's apocryphal or not, is that the English language has continually been transmuted through the incursion of other language groups into it. So and so there's no other language on earth that comes close to the complexity and the multiplicity of the English language.
I think what's fascinating too, you're talking about bringing people in from different
mm-hmm.
cultures. I'll just give you, for instance, I was in a bookstore yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
The name is blanking, but he's the best. He's like the Elvis of Czech Republic. He's the best known singer. There's this
Karl Gott.
That's it. Mm-hmm. And there's this big book, like it's thick,
mm-hmm.
and I've never ever heard of him. And yet, for this culture.
And also German language culture, he's very big, and he was like the Frank Sinatra of this part of Central Europe.
So I guess the point I'm getting at is that's completely foreign to me. So bringing things like this together is what obviously it's a learning process. What else does bringing different people together from different cultures?
Well, there's that, but there's also, it seems to me, the issue of cultural imperialism. Which I think one has to be concerned about, even as it is an inexorable process. I see the bright side of what I do in terms of, in my little tiny fiefdom, bringing these people from different cultural contexts in, but most of our students are native English speakers from the United States, usually folks who are either in graduate writing programs or want to be in them, I spend so much of my time writing letters of recommendation for people and such, but where the hell was I going?
Well, let's just we could get back to connecting it to the book then. So what you're saying is basically this is sort of an institutionalized community
mm-hmm.
that helps people get published.
Well, it spills over into into individial communities. I mean, every university town has its little community of writers, often mostly poets, but also fiction writers who have gone through the universities and continue to live there, either teaching in high schools or starting businesses, or maybe even working at the local community college teaching creative writing. Those who don't actually go off and become professors themselves. It resonates through individual communities, and of course has resonated through the entire culture. And I think we're only beginning to question what exactly it is and what the effects have been.
But it ultimately is, and I want to get to an essay of yours.
Mm-hmm.
In your book, a memoir in essays, poets and the fools who, and the fools, you're calling all your loved ones fools here. Poets and the fools who love them, in this mm-hmm. Book published by it's Louisiana Press, right?
Louisiana State University
Press, yes. And you have something like 17 or 18 books published by various prestigious university mm-hmm. presses,
mm-hmm.
which gets us to the kind of intense. Maybe I'll get you to read this if you could. Just from here
uh-huh.
to there.
Okay.
If you're good with that.
Yeah. Okay. Let me see if it's. Okay. Soon after taking up employment at the Chart House, I met the woman I would live with in her apartment on Dumaine and would eventually ludicrously marry. After my adventures in 3 graduate programs, interspersed with gigs at several upscale French Quarter restaurants, Betty and I moved into what our landlord insisted on one occasion swore was the original house of the Rising Sun on St. Louis between Bourbon and Dauphine, across the street from Al Hurt, or Jumbo, as he insisted we call him. It was there at the age of 29 in the early autumn of 1983 that I received in the mail the package containing 2 hardback copies of my first book, Green Dragons, winner of the Wesleyan University Press New Poets series. I can look back now over the almost 30 years and realize how silly I was as I ripped the envelope open and held my book, gazed into the image on the dust jacket with a soulful intensity I'd never felt before, and would not feel again until 8 years later, when I'd gaze into the crinkled face of my swaddled newborn first daughter. I'm certain that every published writer can tell a similar story of that first moment of clutching that first book, turning it over again and again in one's quavering hands, opening it and flipping rapidly through the pages, lifting it to one's face and breathing it in, all but inhaling it, indeed all but eating it, or feeling that the thing is magic, will magically transform human existence. That feeling is a narcissistic idiocy that soon passes, or at least ratchets down in intensity. At some point one feels, at least I do, a kind of shame for having been so self-consumed, for having invested so much ego into such a simple, even humble object. As one reaches the point when Peggy Lee's "Is That All There Is" becomes something like the national anthem of the inner life, of course all the remembered manifestations of youthful narcissism become a source of great shame, and yet such shame does not empty into regret. I can never regret feeling so marvelous as I did holding in my hands for the first time my first book.
Yeah, so it's that feeling is what participants in workshops want.
Well, yeah, but it's just a simple, a feeling of accomplishment. It's
of what, validation?
Yes, it is. I'm sure it is a feeling of validation. And again, I'm jaded now, but when I was 29 and having worked my entire adult life up to that point to write that first book, to gain the skill set necessary to do so. And also to engage the world as a social being in such a way that it led to that moment. Yes, I look back and I laugh at my former self, but I also rejoice in him and in other young writers who have similar ambition. And I have, over the years, delighted when my students have come to me and told me that they've published their first books, and I know exactly how they feel, and I'm very happy to have had some small part in that process.
So I wonder why validation is so important.
Because personal prestige is as important to an individual as an organism. It is as important as sustenance. To self-esteem is as important as those things we need to live daily.
Is that your opinion, or do you think that's
no? I think it's human nature. I think it's at the very heart of human nature. The desire for social relevance is absolutely integral to the human organism, to human consciousness as such.
Wouldn't you say, though, like, if you got that kind of validation and love, mother's love, parental love, if you got a ton of that early on, you don't need that validation as much, or does everyone need it the same amount?
Depends on the individual, and it, how much of that is physiological and how much of it is, nurture and nature. How much is nurture and how much is nature? I have no freaking idea. I'm quite certain that Ernest Becker in The Denial of Death and The Structure of Evil, two of his most important books, was correct in the assertion that self-esteem is as integral to health as physical sustenance.
Okay. So in other words, this sense that you're, particularly in the context of what we've been talking about, the sense of what you think is valid and worth being paid attention to by others. So is this an exercise in boosting self-esteem?
Look, whether one awakens at the age of 14 to the realization that she or he wants to be a singer or a poet, or whether one awakens and realizes that she or he wants to literally rule the fucking world, both impulses are coming from the same place. It has to do with self-esteem. It has to do with a sense of personal value, and and usually the mechanisms by which a sense of personal value is achieved are pre-existing to one's life. So one comes into life, one is confronted with possibilities, and and through whatever mysterious processes one latches on to one role or another, social role or another that is available to one,
in an effort to
have a sense of purpose, to have a sense of value. That's personal value.
There's a really good line in here that, let's see if I can pull it up, but it has to do with the book being you. Right? It contains you.
Well, it really who touches this book touches a man.
Yes.
Said Walt Whitman. It's a very famous saying. Yeah. So I'm playing with that idea. I'm not so sure I believe that exactly, or in our post-structuralist time, post-structuralist time moment in history, Foucault speaks of the author function rather than the author. We learn that that meaning as such is problematic. That there is a irreconcilable gap between signifier and signified. In the very structure of the English language, and therefore which goes to the very structure of human consciousness, there is a random relation between how we note what we see and the means by which we do so. It's Saussurean linguistics. It's post-structuralist theory. It's it's largely bullshit.
I was going to say, why are we going here?
Well, why not? I mean, because it's one of the defining features of academic discourse. First of all, to regard the world in as structure, and in a post-structural sense, to understand the very means by which we understand it is there's randomness at the very heart of that.
Well, books are the way we understand it.
Yes, but
books are not random.
Well, yes, they are.
Well, your book, you spent a hell of a lot of time pulling it together. That's not random.
No, it's not. But it takes something almost like a religious faith.
Oh, go through the process and get it done, get it
published. I'm taking just once one sees personality, communication as such, in something like purely structural terms, to recede from that, and then to regard one's own ego involvement in the process as having anything like a unique feature, it takes something like a religious faith. So we don't need to follow that because you're you're talking about books as such. But anyway, please.
Well, the thing that fascinates me about books and learning and acquiring knowledge, coming up with new ideas and thoughts and ways of moving forward, that's what makes books so valuable.
But books are physical objects.
Right. Now, no, not so much. I think that's what makes this such an
Well,
interesting time.
Well,
right?
this is what I talk about in
Yes,
this essay.
in the magic book. It's
Because we fetishize, we do you use that? Okay, I would say that we make a fetish of the book, and that's not necessarily a negative thing. I'm simply,
No.
it's descriptive.
Well, it allows me to know where I am in a book, for one thing, and not to be sort of up in cyberspace or in a...
Well,
but I love the book because it gives me a place. I can situate myself physically with this thing. And I could go back and forward and,
Yeah, what I tend to see it in historical terms, and I can't help but to go to the image of Nazi citizens, German citizens under the rule of Nazis, throwing books on large piles of burning books. Mm-hmm. And that gesture, and we see a similar thing happening now, and less dramatically, for now anyway.
For now, yeah.
But let me say that in a couple of hours I'm going to when she wakes up, my sweetheart, who right now is in Karen Maria Subak, who is in Salt Lake City, Utah, she'll be waking up. I'm going to call her, and I have on my computer a book that I bought through Amazon, and it's one of several books that I'm reading aloud to her over the phone, over on FaceTime.
Right.
And I've read 5 or 6 of these books to her since we've been apart over the past few weeks. Reading at least a couple, 3 hours every day. I've gotten very used to pulling up. It's very easy to see on the screen as opposed to in a book. I'm able to go back and forth in the pages. They're all on the same subject, so we're able to kind of cross-reference, at least anecdotally, and So I mean, we happen to be living in a time when the data that we find in books is accessible both in physical terms and also in what we call cyberspace. Okay, fine. Where will that go? I mean, in my essay, I talk about how I have this fanciful idea of myself being born rather in 1953, rather in 2003 or something like that, maybe in 2040. Getting an email saying that you have been your book has been accepted for publication. Your new book of poems. So in that book will have been won a prize, say, like my first book did, and maybe it was taken from thousands of other submissions. So I can really feel good about it. There has been a gatekeeper process, and I have somehow broken through, and my book is going to be published online, but still published. Will I be as elated at that as getting that book in the mail that I got when I was a kid, when I was 29 years old, and I was able to open it up and smell it, and hold it, and all that. I mean, it may be qualitatively obviously is a different kind of experience. But I cannot tell you what the psychological effect will be. Because
it's still acceptance, isn't it?
Well, because your and my consciousness, because of virtue of our age, is grounded in the fetishization of the physical object, and whereas myself, 30, 40 years younger, will have a very different relation to the physical nature of the book, right. and to the very nature of information as such. And the consumption of information, and the very idea of style, and voice, and relevancy even. It's difficult to unring the bell of one's adolescent dreams.
You had this physical object in your mind.
I had it in my mind.
Yes.
Of course I did. Whereas
Yes.
someone 40 years younger may not have it in her or his or their minds.
I just want to look at the journey that you've taken. Mm-hmm. Growing up poor, and you do mention throughout your book of essays, Poets and the Fools Who Loved Them, mm-hmm. that you were in the projects and that you were poor. Mm-hmm. That's quite a journey that you've taken, isn't it?
Yeah. My father was wanted in 47 states when he was caught. We lived on the road. Literally on the road my childhood. He was caught when I was 7, And we lived in Elizabeth City, North Carolina on welfare, and then we lived in Norfolk, Virginia on welfare when he got caught a second time, just a year or two after he got out of prison. You know, I was adopted, you know, in my early teens by family, by his sister, whom I didn't know, and her husband. So yeah, I've been very lucky, you know. But yeah, I had, you know, very odd beginning. My life was very odd, you know, relatively speaking. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
You ripped off a couple of poetry books from the Salvation Army, and they changed your. Did they really change your life?
Yeah. I purloined these fucking books, and you know, and ran like hell, and I had no idea what I was looking at. You know, I was a kid. I was in the projects. I didn't know what a poem was, but they were weird. You know, and I was attracted to their weirdness. You know, more than their wisdom, because I couldn't really perceive the wisdom. But I could see their weirdness, and I guess the main thing was I got a sense of these guys, you know, speaking their feelings, which was not something we were encouraged to do, you know, and I wasn't either. I mean, I was socialized as a punk in the, you know, I was a punk, you know, I was getting in trouble and I fought a lot. I got in a lot of fights. And but at the same time, you know, I had this clandestine life, you know, reading these poems and trying to write this stuff.
It's so interesting you used the word weird. We're in Prague, and that's the word you connect with. I connect with Kafka.
You know, I simply mean that, you know, there was nothing in my life experience to prepare me for it. I mean, the only thing
and you didn't have any teachers to show you the way. You just, and that's the thing. Most of us at that age would look at this stuff and say, "Fuck, I don't want to do that. I want to go play hockey or field hockey or you know, baseball or whatever."
Yeah. Well, you know, I mean, I did all that. You know, I played baseball, football, basketball. I got a black belt in karate in Japan when I was a kid, and I got through college teaching karate.
Wow.
And you know, it was pretty good. You know, but. You know, but there was always that. There was always poetry, you know, and
that is weird. That it's in itself is weird.
It's very weird, you know, and so I spent so much of my adult life trying to figure out how that happened, you know, and what that meant. But it was, you know, I stayed on the path, and you know, unlike a lot of people, you know, I made a life for myself, you know, as a poet. But then I segued into writing primarily prose.
And you've got like how many degrees?
I have an undergraduate degree and a graduate degree, but I was a Hoynes Fellow at the University of Virginia before I went to University of Arkansas and studied there with Miller Williams and James Whitehead and two wonderful poets. And then I went to Iowa, you know, the Iowa Writers Workshop. But when I got to Iowa, I already had a contract for my first book with Wesleyan.
How long were you in Iowa?
Just for a year, because I'd gone to like 4 or 5 years of graduate school before that, and they accepted everything. Plus, because I had a book coming out, they just treated me differently than other students, for better and for worse. But you know, I went there mainly because I wanted to work with Gerald Stern. And Larry Levis, you know, an old friend of mine, but who was a very famous poet, kind of like an older brother. I didn't know him real well, but he was very close to people who were like brothers to me. And he expedited the process. I transferred from Arkansas into Iowa. You know, and Iowa is the top of the food chain and the whole creative writing biz. You know,
right. And then you eventually set up this program here in Prague.
Yep.
And you told me when we first met that there were like 160 people involved
at one
in it.
At one point, I think in the early 2000s, I think we had up to 164. I think that was the number, over 160. I think it was 164 people students in the program. And but we were averaging between, at the low end, 80, and at the top end like 110, 120. So we were it was a big program. It was huge programs. I mean, there's been nothing like it since then.
And now it's a fraction of
20.
that.
You know,
and why is that?
Well, because I before it was a university program, and I took it back from the university.
What'd you do that for?
Because I was running in because of politics, because of university politics, and no bitterness, no, it's just that, I know.
It took forever, you mean? Things did?
Well, what happened was that in the aggregate, the program has always made money. I'll just put it bluntly, and what happened for 2 years running was that the system by which the university was granting academic credit to individuals who were not matriculating from Western Michigan University was problematized in ways that I don't need to get into. But what it resulted in 1 year was the fact that well over 100 people tried to apply to the program, and only something like 40 of them were around 40 of them were able actually to get through the process, and they came to Prague just pissed off, at the university.
And you were on the receiving end.
Well, yeah, yes and no. I mean, they weren't able to compare it to previous years or anything. But what they came and they just said, "What's going on with your university?" And there's no one person to blame. It was a systemic problem. And so, there was a point at which I simply said, look, I'm going to take this program. Obviously, you don't want to run this thing anymore. Otherwise, you'd solve this problem. So I'm going to take it back. What it came down to was the fact that mechanism within the university that facilitated study abroad programs reached a point where it was economically more advantageous to bring foreign students to WMU than it was to have a large program of American students abroad. It was just a matter of economics. Certain people within that unit did not understand. They didn't understand the power of the program, and its resonance within the cottage industry of creative writing. They just didn't get it. And so rather than try to persuade them, rather than try to go over their heads, which I could have done, or just play internal politics, which I'm just, at that point even, I was too old to do. I simply said, I'll take it back. I will start it. I will privatize it. So it is now a LLC out of Michigan.
What's LLC?
Limited liability company. So the whole issue of academic credit is gone, for now anyway. Though we do have a mechanism by which students can earn credit, and it's we don't need to get into that now. But there is a bureaucratic process by which that's possible.
Okay.
And I'm in the process now also of working with folks at Anglo-American University to maybe affiliate with them, at least loosely. I never want to give the program up again to a university completely.
But your wish, your goal, is to build it up to another, or are you okay with it right now?
I like it with the way it is right now. Maybe get it up to 30 or 40 and keep it there, and be just be as exclusive as I can be within that make it more exclusive, maybe a little bigger, but not a whole lot bigger. Maybe 3 or 4 workshops. Then I can hire more, famous writers. But if one looks at our website and the faculty that is taught for the program, it's pretty impressive. It's a who's who of English language literature, American literature, really.
Okay, maybe what we could do then is I'm going to be participating in the program.
Right.
So this is our before.
Yeah.
And perhaps what we could do at the end of it is to do an after.
Yeah. Well, because then it'll be more, because you will have gone through it, you will have specific questions about process.
Right.
And we can kind of step down from the highfalutin thought. Yeah, that'd be great.
Anything else you want to get on the record before as a baseline?
I don't know. Except to say that I'm proud of what I do. I think it's subversive by its very nature, and I think it's a very healthy subversion.
Why is it subversive?
Well, the radical egalitarianism that is implicit in the cottage industry of creative writing is subversive, because it has always been profoundly elitist. That is to say, the writer emerges from the general population. The real writer is someone who suffers for her or his or their art and emerges, through some organic process. That is true, but and not everyone who takes creative writing workshops is going to be a quote successful writer. But I do think that it is a pedagogy, the nature of which results in people being more thoughtful readers, and I think that is the primary value of the workshop. It is not that it turns out writers, but that it has facilitated the formation over time of a relatively large community of readers who just happen to consider themselves writers, most of them. So, make of that what one will.
Well, I will just have one last question,
Sure.
and that is, why is it so important to have more good readers?
Well, it's as important as it is for there to be, more good swimmers. To have a pop, it seems to me to be a pretty basic skill.
We'd have a more sane world, maybe, if you want to go big picture.
Well, but in the phase of late capitalism, when everything is commoditized, the world of art, of which the cottage industry of creative writing is one facet, is it seems to me it mitigates against the more negative aspects of a wholly commercial culture.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks. That's a great place to end, and I look forward to beginning again in about a month or so. Okay.
Yeah, it'll be fun. You're going to have a good time here, I think.
I'm already having a great time, and I'm glad to have met you. So
Glad to have met you too, sir.
Richard Katrovas is the founding director of the Prague Summer Program for Writers and the author of 17 books of prose and verse, including, most recently, Poets and the Fools Who Love Them, a memoir and essays. Thanks again.
By the way, poets are the primary readers of poetry. So the fools that love them are other poets. So poets are fools. And this is made fair. This joke is at the heart of the book, really.
Very good.
Yeah.
Thanks again.
You bet.